Jonathan, can you tell us, in a sense, what's gone wrong with the corporate world? There are huge companies now which, their turnover is bigger than lots of countries as a whole, and their practices are, having, in many ways, can be a very strongly detrimental effect socially. So how is it that companies have somehow become uncontrollable, beyond the ability of any one government to kind of rein them in?
Yes, you wonder why we need to address these issues. Well, of course, as we know, there's a big issue about relationships in societies generally, in families, in social makeup, and that's been reflected very much in company operations. But in some ways, companies have exacerbated that. And there's quite an interesting history for this, certainly from a legal point of view. That is that originally, if you or I set up a business, or if we do that now, we have responsibility. So even if we say we buy a house, we have responsibility for the debt to buy the house. And when people set up in business as an individual or a group of individuals, and they enter into contracts, they have personal liability on that contract. So if they can't pay the debt, they can remain bankrupt, they have to take responsibility for their actions. And when companies were first set up as legal entities many years ago, again, the shareholders who essentially owned the companies had personal responsibility. So although the company was an entity and owned its assets, it took on liabilities, took on debts, it entered into contracts. If something went wrong and the company couldn't meet those liabilities, then the individual shareholders had responsibility, personal liability for those debts. And the argument is obviously that made them behave in a responsible way. They get the upside, but they take the risk of the downside. And then about 150 years ago, they were introduced the idea of limited liability companies, which means that if you or I buy shares in a company, maybe on the stock market in this country or any other country, then if something goes wrong to the underlying company, we as shareholders don't have responsibility, we don't have liability, we don't pick up the liabilities of the company. And then after that, the markets developed. So we had the situation where you and I could trade in shares, and our pension funds are in shares, our investments are in shares, and they are very often invested through financial intermediaries, the so-called institutions. And what they're looking for is a financial return. You and I have normally no say in where this money goes if we invest them through those type of institutions. And therefore you've drawn a line between the company, the responsibility of the directors running the company is essentially to make money, make financial return for us as the ultimate capital providers. So the shareholders who own the company essentially have no responsibility for what happens in the company, no responsibility as to whether the directors are getting rid of employees, whether they're paying suppliers on time. And this has all led to the concept of the company not being a community interest, a group of people pulling together in the interest of society, serving all the interested parties involved in it, but simply essentially a money-making machine to try and draw funds out as rapidly as possible on a consistent basis for shareholders. And then these institutions and other bodies buying and selling shares can buy and sell them almost as a commodity, really. So if they're not happy with the performance, they just sell, and you see this happening when the stock market goes up and down. So as I say, that led to the companies operating as sort of financial machines, then being tough with suppliers, delaying payment so they improve their own cash flow, being tough with employees, regarding employees more as an asset rather than people and looking after their interests, and rewarding the highest paid executives with shares and bonuses, but not putting that all down the group. And what we're looking at is to try and make companies more responsible to stakeholders as a whole, and by building up relationships with all the stakeholders.
Yeah, and I can think back in the past where employers perhaps would tend to exploit their workers, and the workers were able to band together, form trades unions, and collectively negotiate with employers. So that in some ways protected the that one particular stakeholder.
Yes.
So, but in this case, you have somehow, it seems that a number of the other stakeholders are also suffering, and it's very hard to rein in, for example, the bonuses being paid to top executives and the CEO pay just seems to be going up and up and up, whereas the ordinary workers' pay is hardly moving. So, is there a need for something, another sort of mechanism almost perhaps to try and, the idea of rating companies on a relational basis, do you think that is perhaps a way to draw attention to this?
Well, you've given there some very good examples of the problems that have arisen, the way companies are run, because essentially the shareholders are taking no responsibility for what the directors do, the way the company's run. They're just looking for a financial return. And they've been prepared to reward the senior people, the executives in the company, the senior executives, to what's called aligning their interests with the shareholders, which isn't necessarily the right way of looking at it. So they say if they, as shareholders, it comes back to the financial return point I made before, are making a good return, they're happy for the executives to make a good return. But on the other hand, that doesn't help the people lower down the tree, as you say, the lower paid, the average paid employees, or the people, the lowest paid employees. And what's been happening, certainly in the UK and in other countries as well, is that there's been a huge disparity, an increasing disparity, between the levels of pay of the lowest paid and the highest paid in the companies. There is great disquiet about this. Governments are looking at it, and shareholders profess concern, and sometimes they challenge these pay packages. In particular, directors can be paid for their company's favour, in a sense, because the results don't speak in such a way that they should get these high rewards. But there is a particular issue here looking at relational aspects, and that is, what does it say to somebody who's the lowest paid, somebody working on the checkout desk at a supermarket, who has a stressful job and working long hours, maybe at weekends, late into the night sometimes. What does it say to them if they're being paid 300-400 times less than the senior executives? There is going to be a difference because of questions of responsibility, but these differentials are increasing. The statistics show each year they're getting wider and wider. So there is a particular relational issue there as to the respect that the companies show their employees. And the one answer to this, one answer would be to have one of our big groups, merchandiser groups in the UK, have a bonus system, so all the employees get exactly the same bonus depending on the results of the group. Obviously the amount they get is going to be different because the amount they're paid is different, and they really appreciate that because they see an acknowledgement that the senior person has worked hard and get a certain percentage, but they worked hard as a lower paid employees, and they get the same percentage.
That's an example of a company that is more like a community, which is the word you used before. Now, how might we put the brakes on all the other big companies which are, exhibiting these kind of behaviours? What might be done to influence them to move more in the direction of being communities and less cash machines for shareholders?
Well, one idea we've got is the Relational Business Charter, which is measured by an independent body, the Relational Rating Agency, like a credit rating agency, which would be independently run. And we've tested this. So the agency would look at published information by listed companies, because they put out report and accounts every year and these corporate social responsibility statements I mentioned. And we measure them against what we call the 10 principles of the Charter. And these address specific issues like pay differentials, how much is the pay differential, as to whether employees get bonuses, as to whether employees and their families are looked after, in particular by making sure that all employees have at least one day off each weekend to be with their families or to work with the local community. And other issues, for instance, responsibility on tax. So a company should pay tax in the country where it has its operations. After all, the company takes advantage of people who are educated in the country, they use the road system, they use the security system, and the stability of the government. So there are 10 different aspects we look at. Another one would be looking after suppliers, and certainly in the UK and I know in other countries, companies unilaterally extend the payment date during which they can pay the suppliers, and that has a huge impact if they delay payment on the cash flow and therefore the financial viability of those companies. So by measuring these companies as to how they comply with the principles of the Relational Business Charter, we can give them a mark and then publish that information. Then we do that in conjunction with the companies if they're prepared to comment on what information we produce on these assessments. And that would be a measure as to, an indication as to how relationally the company is operating. And we think that would be interesting and encouraging for shareholders to see that. For employees, obviously they'd like to work in a company that behaves responsibly to employees, to suppliers, to customers, and to governments generally. So we hope that way to change the way companies are seen and therefore gradually to change the way companies are prepared to operate.
Great. Thank you very much.